You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 321 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about the arrest of Chelsea Manning for refusing to testify at a secret federal court. This case is so important because it deals with the persecution of whistleblowers and news outlets like WikiLeaks, the sealed indictment against Julian Assange. It's important to journalism and journalists being able to talk to sources and get documents and publish them to expose to the American people the horrific things that our government are doing and hiding it behind classifications and claiming top secret. And of course, just for all of our rights. I mean, First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, Sixth Amendment. We're going to talk about all that on today's show. I'm really going to ask that if you like the show that you take the time to share this one just because I think the topic is so important. Best place to find online is at the Libertarian Institute. The show and my daily news roundup are featured there on the homepage, libertarianinstitute.org. You can also find the show on all the different podcatchers and everything, so subscribe to the show. If there's a place to leave a rating and review, do that. And if you really want to help the show, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. So I'll go ahead and start by saying that I view what Chelsea Manning is doing here as absolutely heroic and courageous. I mean, simply refusing to testify at a federal grand jury because you see the grand jury system as being a way for federal prosecutors to intimidate witnesses. I mean, to a libertarian like me, that's heroic enough, but for all the other reasons I'm going to talk about here, this is an incredibly important thing that Chelsea Manning is doing. Now, I want to briefly hit, I think, some of the early parts of the story here. Of course, this all kicks off when Bradley Manning, who is a transgender woman who now goes by Chelsea Manning, passes to WikiLeaks tons of important information. I think this is the Iraq and Afghan war logs and the State Department cables. Now, I really don't remember this story at the beginning just because I was in high school at the time and wasn't paying attention to this story more on than the surface level of, you know, these are the leaks that came out, and the big argument here was whether Chelsea Manning put Americans at risk by exposing this information, and that this was just obscuring Americans' view of the war. It really wasn't a fair representation of what was going on. Of course, some of the most important things to come out here were the collateral murder video, which shows two Reuters journalists being mowed down by an American airship in Iraq after I think their cameras were mistakenly identified as rifles, and then rescuers were again mowed down by the American airship. And it's a clear example of a war crime. And yeah, you also have the audio of the pilots as, you know, they shoot and fly around here, and, you know, they're kind of saying, come on, let us shoot, let us kill these people. I mean, of course, I'm sure they all thought that, you know, these were terrorists and that what they were doing is going to save an American's life on the ground by kind of spotting this ambush ahead of time and taking out these guys before they were able to take out ours. Now, the reality is that these are civilians and journalists, and I think children were at least wounded, if not killed, in this attack. And it's just an absolutely brutal and disgusting thing that was done by Americans in Iraq during, you know, the Iraq War too. There's a couple other things I'll link to in the show notes page about Chelsea Manning. The one of these is the visual for Julian, which comes out every Friday, I think at 4 p.m. Eastern. Check it out if, you know, you're just sitting around that time. It's usually hosted by Joe Lauria and Elizabeth Voss, and what it is they just invite people on the show. I think mostly talk about current events and why WikiLeaks is important in the state of journalism and all these kinds of topics that I talk about on this show as well. They get guests like John Kiriakou. I think Scott Horton did one at one point. Dan Ellsberg, Gareth Porter. So it's a really cool thing. But this week they hyper focus on the Chelsea Manning situation, as, you know, they were talking about just later that day. But anyways, at the end of that show, they actually have on Greg Paulus, who did some investigative reporting using some of the State Department cables that Chelsea Manning gave to WikiLeaks. And it showed that I believe the Deep Horizon oil spill was predictable because a very similar thing happened in the Caspian Sea, but executives from the big oil companies, the State Department, and the government of Azerbaijan covered it up. And so while there was actually a previous example of, I believe he said the quick drying cement not being enough to hold, I guess because of the pressure, that this was predictable that this then should have happened in the Gulf, but because it was covered up, it happened again. Or at the very least, it adds a lot more responsibility to these people. And this is actually something about that oil spill that I didn't even know. So anyways, those are some of the important documents that come out because of Chelsea Manning at the time. I think it really raises the prominence of the WikiLeaks organization. Now, I'm not exactly familiar with all the details here, but Chelsea Manning is caught, and they carry out a very extensive cyber operation to, discover all the evidence in this case. And she's clearly guilty. I don't know if she, really makes a defense, but she goes through a military court trial, is found guilty and sentenced to 35 years in prison. I always think it's worth noting that this actually happened under the Obama administration and not under the Bush administration, just to show that, anybody who's in power, views, I think, these leakers as bad people just because it limits the amount of power they have. At the very end of the Obama administration, he grants Chelsea Manning clemency, and she's released from jail in the early days of the Trump administration. It's also worth knowing that during her jail stay, she was looking to start treatment, for whatever gender realignment that she wanted to do, being a transgender woman, and was in solitary confinement for 2 years. And for those of you who don't know this, there's some pretty good research out there, and I'll find something to link to in the show notes page if anybody wants to take a deeper dive or disagrees with me. But, long-term solitary confinement is pretty equivalent to torture. Yes, I'm sure the CIA did worse things to alleged terrorists after 9/11, like waterboarding somebody a few times a day for a month in a row. But at the same time, it takes a real physical toll on the body and the mind not having anybody to socialize with for such a long time. And her jail stay also included, I believe, 2 suicide attempts. And she certainly had some public mental health stuff going on since she's been released from prison as well. And I don't mean this insultingly because of her left-wing ideology, just because she's publicly talked about, having some real mental health issues on Twitter. Now, 2 weeks ago, about Chelsea Manning announces that she has received a subpoena to testify in the Eastern Virginia District federal grand jury, and everybody kind of assumes that it must be about the Assange ties. Now, Chelsea Manning has been in jail from 2010 till 2017, and so it seems like there's no possible way that she could be behind in any way anything that happened along the lines with Russia in the 2016 election or anything like that. And so it was pretty quickly assumed that what this grand jury must be looking at is something related to Assange and what happened back before 2010 and all those leaks. On the last show, I talked about how, this is also the same district where the sealed indictment against Julian Assange is. So, there's pretty good evidence that this has something to do with Assange. Now, one of the reasons that people think they're looking for this testimony is because of what they call the New York Times problem. It's very clear that the United States could attempt to prosecute Julian Assange under the Espionage Act, as he has possessed top secret U.S. documents without a security clearance. However, the problem is that a lot of reporters for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and tons of other media outlets have all received secret documents from leakers and have published them many times to the great benefit of the rest of us. So if you look at like Dan Ellsberg with the Pentagon Papers, I think at that time it would have been like the Washington Post that, could have then been prosecuted under the Espionage Act, or James Risen in some of the reporting that he was doing in his book for the New York Times about the secret spying program. So nobody really wants to set that case precedent, right? That we're going to go ahead and prosecute journalists who possess and publish classified information. The interesting thing here is there was one of the Cuomos was on CNN back when the Clinton emails were released and saying that it's only legal for him to look at it at CNN, but it's not legal for anybody else to look at it. Well, that's not exactly true because, this is what we're talking about here that would be illegal for journalists to look at. Now, maybe the court ends up at the end of the day deciding that, hell no, you can't do this. The First Amendment is the cornerstone of American democracy, and we are absolutely not going to allow the government to say that journalists can't possess classified information. Although they've, allowed the whistleblowers to certainly be persecuted. So it appears what maybe they would be looking for in the testimony is something about Chelsea Manning being influenced in any way or having communications with Julian Assange prior to releasing the documents to WikiLeaks that they could use to basically, I think, collusion. Now you're also guilty of the crimes that Chelsea Manning is kind of the legal trick that they would provide. Now, on that UND for Julian visual that I was talking about before, Joe Lauria explains that Bob Perry, who, very important investigative journalist, explained that there's nothing wrong with this either, that journalists should be pushing their sources to answer questions and to maybe give up more information than they want to if they think, that's what's important to exposing an important story. And so there's a lot of danger behind, going that route through this trial as well. Another big piece of this puzzle, and one of the other very important reasons for Chelsea Manning's stand right now is because of the abuses that are allowed by the government under the federal grand jury system. In this case, Chelsea Manning was going to be forced to go before this court and testify without any representation. They pulled a legal trick by giving her immunity, then saying that you can't take the Fifth Amendment either because you're not allowed to testify. You can't testify against yourself because we're saying anything you say, we're not going to prosecute you for. So that's a pretty dirty trick. There's also the issue that there was an extensive military court-martial hearing about what happened with Chelsea Manning releasing these documents. And so all that information is already known. And if they want to, they could go back over and look through those documents, but they don't actually have to interview the witness again. And then there's also, I think, a lot of issue around grand juries and the court of public opinion, where getting indicted by a grand jury oftentimes means the mainstream media, especially whatever media is kind of hostile to your particular position, is going to portray that as being equivalent to a conviction. This is, something that John Kiriakou has talked about. And it makes it really difficult for you to represent yourself because, you could end up behind bars very early on without being convicted. People around you start moving away from you because there's a real perception in this country that our court and judicial system is very accurate and fair. And so anybody that's in jail must be there for a reason. And, if not, they won't be there very long. I mean, they'll get on appeal, right away. There's also a real issue here with this being a secret court. Not only does she not get representation, but, nobody's even allowed in to witness this and make sure that what's going on is in any way above board. And also, I think they're able to limit what Chelsea Manning could publicly say about this. Now, it's worth talking about the coverage of the actual event, which was almost non-existent. Ford Fisher was one of a few journalists who actually did attend. He did an interview with my friend Joanne Leon on her show Around the Empire that I'll link to in the show notes page as well, where he kind of discusses his little interview he gets with Chelsea before the hearing, and then the statement that her lawyer made after. Now, from the reporting that I've heard, Chelsea Manning's strategy at this hearing was to go in and to answer every question by evoking her First, Fourth, and Sixth Amendment rights. Hopefully in the coming days, I'm going to have somebody with a little bit more legal knowledge to come in and explain exactly what portion of each amendment that she's taking here. Because I'm not sure on the First Amendment one if it would be a compelled speech situation, which I think is a real problem, or maybe a journalistic freedom one. I'm not sure what the Fourth Amendment rationale is. I think the Sixth Amendment rationale is very interesting, kind of saying that this isn't a public trial and I don't have representation. These are two things that I should be guaranteed as an American. All right, so now the situation is that Chelsea Manning has been arrested. Her legal team says that their kind of focus right now is making sure she gets adequate mental health care while she's in jail. I believe she could remain in jail for up to 18 months or the length of the grand jury. Now, there is an appeals process to this, fortunately, so it's not like they just get lock her away and never say anything about it again, but this is a real problem. I think I don't have a whole else lot more to add here other than just to emphasize that this is one of the biggest middle fingers I have seen to the federal government. And I think in the past I've talked about on the show somebody like Erwin Schiff, who refused to pay taxes, seeing it as being illegal, and coercion and force used against him, and, spending his life pretty much in and out of jail because of it. That, Chelsea Manning is taking a very similar kind of stand here against the system that, she finds to be really unjust, and I really can't disagree in any way. And taking on just so many things right now, this is important for the trial of Julian Assange, as I outlined earlier. And, there's a lot of reporting around the Ecuadorian government possibly working with the United States to have him extradited, or at least kicked out of the Ecuadorian embassy, where he would there be picked up by British police and likely then extradited to the United States. So I'm sure this is a story that's going to continue to unfold. I'm going to continue to talk to it on the show about it on the show. And, maybe some public pressure will be something that could get people to stand up here. I mean, I've been very surprised by the lack of support from Chelsea Manning from the left, just because, this is a transgender woman who receives so much hatred from the right that it seems like the kind of person that, they would want to jump all over and, kind of really support it and make that a cause. But generally that hasn't happened. I mean, it's kind of right now from what I see on Twitter is the principled libertarians, the kind of principled leftists, the typical anti-war crowd, and then plus maybe the left-wing progressive LGBT movement. But, she's certainly making a big sacrifice right now, standing up for rights, freedom, journalistic integrity, and all that stuff. And, any support we could give, we should. All right, next I want to talk about Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. And I've discussed her in the show in the past, and the, statements that she made that people were calling, anti-Semitic, or the, kind of phrase of the week was anti-Semitic trope. But after the last incident I talked about where she said the thing all about the Benjamins, talking about Israeli influence and their lobby in the United States, she incurred the wrath of the centrists again by criticizing the Israeli state. And there was another bill in Congress that was set out to condemn her, largely backed by the kind of Democrat establishment, the Senator Nancy Pelosi types. I'm going to link to the article in the AP because I think they do a very good job of breaking this down, actually, kind of for mainstream reporting. But essentially, it turned out that the Democrat Party was not on board for this. They didn't see what Representative Omar said as being anti-Semitic. And, I've seen a real discussion on the left coming about here about, being anti-Semitic versus being anti-Israel. Or just, saying that the Israeli state is wrong sometimes. That is certainly my position, that I never really equate the general people of a country with their government. I think the government oftentimes ends up being the worst of them and doing the, worst things of all the people. And so, every single Israeli citizen is obviously not responsible for the crimes of their government. Now, the more supportive somebody is of their government, the, more criticism I would have for that person. But generally, I think most people just don't pay attention to the crimes of their government and only look at kind of the ways their government directly impacts them. So what the House ends up passing actually is a broad bill that quote unquote condemns hate. I mean, to me, this kind of thing is more of a political theater stunt, and so I really don't care all that much about it. However, it, also condemns anti-Muslim hatred, and so this is, I guess, like the first time a U.S. bill has been passed with that language, and that kind of younger generation, more progressive Democrat crowd is really championing this as a victory over the party's establishment leadership. And I think it does show an important divide that's going to be, coming really to a head in 2020, where you have even the slightly more progressive candidates like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders taking this more middle ground position that, Representative Omar and people on the more pro-Palestinian side, or at least those who I would say view the Palestinians as victims, are not anti-Semitic. Where I think they are still generally supportive of the Israeli state and wouldn't, agree with Representative Omar's criticisms, at least not in public. And then you have the more establishment candidates who are coming out and outright, condemning Representative Omar as well. Saying that she's anti-Semitic and people shouldn't be saying these things. So I think there's going to be a really good opportunity in these 2012 election cycles to talk about the situation in Israel-Palestine. And so I hope to, in the coming months, do a few more episodes on that situation. Maybe I'll get Joanne back on the show to talk about, that divide in the Democrat Party and the ways, the new doors and windows that are going to be opened here to talk about the absolutely unfair situation towards the Palestinians and, what reforms need to be done to fix that. Now, even better from Representative Omar is her criticisms about Obama that came out in a Politico article. Basically, she said that he was droning people and referred to his policy of locking children in detention centers along the southern border, and kind of says that he was able to get away with murder because he was politically savvy, he had a nice face and a nice smile. So, first of all, to hear this from like a Democratic representative, that's awesome because everything she said was true. The Obama's drone policy was an awful humanitarian disaster. It was a policy that signed the death sentence of any quote-unquote military-aged Muslim male pretty much in the greater Middle East. If you look at, it was the case in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, Iraq, and Syria. And she kind of rightfully points out how that, everybody's pointing the finger now at Trump about the awful immigration policy, but Obama really wasn't all that much better on it. It was just kind of like the Trump policy, but turned down to 5 instead of up to 8. And, say what you will about immigration, I'm never for locking little kids in prisons. That's just a terrible, awful, traumatizing thing to do. Now, after this article came out, there was this really weird controversy thing where I felt like, I guess because I agree with the statement that she was making anyways, maybe I didn't see it as being problematic how Politico reported it, but she was upset about it, put out an audio version of what she said that generally seemed to back the narrative in the article, and then she later deleted that tweet. So there was this weird thing that happened afterwards, but I don't know, what she said in the article was great, and I hope she, kind of sits with that criticism of attacking the left from the left. There was a story in the New York Times about a UN report saying that Israel may have committed, I believe, crimes against humanity in their treatment of the Palestinians, particularly the people of Gaza, during their Great Return marches that occurred every Friday from March 30th on, and I think are still going on, so we're kind of maybe approaching the 1-year anniversary of that. In 2018, you had upwards of 200 Palestinians being killed, close to 10,000 or so shot by either live fire or rubber-coated steel bullets, many more injured by tear gas inhalation and being hit by those canisters. Medics, journalists, and children are among the dead and injured. And, the Israeli response of using this massive amount of tear gas while hiding behind a couple barbed wire fences and saying that the Palestinians can't come within 100 meters of that fence, while the Palestinians at best roll flaming tires to the fence, attach ropes to it, and throw rocks at the Israeli soldiers. There are also reports of use of, kind of firebombs or Molotov cocktails and attempted incendiary devices to kites that I think started a few fires. Overall, when you look at the casualty figures, it's something like tens of thousands of Gazan protesters injured, with hundreds killed, and then about 4 Israelis injured in total. So it's a clearly one-sided event. There's clearly crimes committed by the Israelis, whether you want to call it crimes against humanity or not. I don't know the international legal definition of all of it, but it's not a good policy. It's a terrible policy, and, people need to start speaking up for the Palestinians. That way, the 2 million people who live in Gaza, the majority of that population being under 18 and being refugees, could get out and live some kind of life, because right now they're entrapped in this kind of tiny area of the Gaza Strip. They can't get off the coast to fish. They're relying on aid that could be shut off at any time by the Israelis. And Gaza's just been bombed to rubble. They can't import concrete, and 50-something% unemployment. It's an awful situation. I guess I wanted to cover this a little bit earlier, but I missed it and really want to talk about it. NBC News had an opinion piece out by Mark Hanna with the Eurasia Group Foundation that did a study of Americans and found that Democrat or Republican, they're generally want a less interventionist foreign policy. A couple of actual stats from the piece are 80% want some kind of diplomatic solution with Iran. 2/3 of voters, be it Democrat or Republican, see the ideal of America being great, not the America indispensable nation. What we do around the world is great. So I think that's a good view. Rand Paul used to always use the shining city on a hill example that, we should be what other countries strive to be. We don't go out, kill people, and try to make them like us. There did seem to be a general notion that the Republican war slogan of peace through strength isn't something necessarily believed, and Republicans are more in favor of a, kind of more American-centric foreign policy, and that liberals generally rejected kind of the right responsibility to protect foreign policy initiatives. And so, these are really good because it's the right and the left rejecting the right and left-wing excuses for this super interventionist foreign policy. Of course, the big problem is that a majority of Americans may not support the intervention, but so few of the political pundits are anywhere near the positions of the American people. And so the politicians and the people who talk to us on TV hold these much more interventionist policies, and that never gets out to, everybody to build any kind of consensus, because I think everybody who has these kind of general views that we shouldn't be quite so interventionist doesn't have a voice to reflect them, or many at least, in politics and in the media. Before I sign off here, I just want to talk about Yemen, mostly bleak news, of course, pretty much anytime I talk about Yemen. A story from Consortium News, I'll link to it in the show notes page. Yemen received a third of the coverage that the royal wedding received from weeknight TV broadcast news in 2018. So Yemen got a total of 20 minutes worth of coverage, while the royal wedding got 61 minutes worth of coverage. I mean, this should be absolutely disgusting to us. The royal wedding is a one-time event. The Yemen war was on, year 3 through 2018. That's what was going on. We have thousands of children starving to death in 2018 in Yemen. Tens of thousands of people, innocent civilians, being killed during the conflict during this past year. You've had this giant humanitarian crisis, and maybe a little bit more attention drawn to the situation with the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, but generally a complete media blackout. And so even if Americans, as I was talking about before, start to have these more non-interventionist foreign policy, if they don't even know that there's a war in Yemen going on, how could they be opposed to it? A new study was done, and I believe this is just a study that looked into and investigated 27 incidents in Yemen between, I think, mid-2017 and early 2018 of airstrikes that killed civilians. 27 of those. They found that in 25 of those cases, U.S. weapons were used, and in 5 cases, UK weapons were used. Over 200 civilians died in those strikes. Over 1,000 were injured, and a disproportionate number, I think 122 were children. Now, I was trying to look and see exactly which the incidents were counted in these strikes, because my guess is that there's an inflated number of, maybe children included by including strikes on schools or the strike on the bus. Certainly very tragic, but, I don't know how that translates to, looking at the war as a whole. That was just the point I wanted to make about the study. However, the important part about the study is documented. We know that U.S. and U.K. bombs were used to kill 200 civilians in Yemen. At least. That's still in itself horrific. 122 children. Horrific. Enough, you would think, for the U.S. and the U.K. to say, we're done giving you guys weapons. You're using them to massacre children. We're not going to be a part of that. And yet, you have Germany having to stand up to the U.K. and the U.K. pushing Germany to sell more weapons to Saudi Arabia. All right, last on Yemen here. And, kind of probably the worst news in the grand scheme of things is, of course, fighting in heavy amounts has restarted in and around the city of Hadida. This is the key port city that brings aid, fuel to most of the people of Yemen. I think about 80%. And it's mostly trickles through or doesn't come through at all, because there's an ongoing battle for this city. in December there was a ceasefire negotiated by the UN. Unfortunately, the language of it was too vague, I think, to really take hold, and it did knock off fighting in Hodeidah for a few months, and I've read reports every now and then that access to grain silos was given, so, more food has gotten out to the people of Yemen than maybe otherwise would have because this deal was in place. However, it didn't actually resolve the situation, and so now it looks like that ceasefire has completely fallen apart, and they're back at war in Hodeidah. It seems that one of the key narratives coming out of this that I'm seeing in the media reports is that they're saying that the Houthis were not living up to their end of the deal because the deal said that they needed to turn Hodeidah over to a local security force. Having followed this war for 3 years and reading, all the time about how, refugees are coming and going to Hodeidah, and the fact that this city has been occupied by the Houthis for a couple of years and it's been under siege and, kind of a key target of Saudi Arabia and their air war for at least the past 2 or 3 years, means I don't know what a local Hodeidah security force would look like. It may be that that's actually the Houthis now, just based on moving fighters into the city and everybody else fleeing from it. And so the issue I think at one point is the Houthis said they turned the ports over to the Houthi or the Yemeni Coast Guard, and the Yemeni government said, well, the Coast Guard is just the Houthis because, that's the same people who was the Houthi Navy a month ago. And so, I'm not really sure how to resolve that situation. It seems one of those just super complicated things because of war. But I do know that the Americans could get the hell out of it, and we could stop selling weapons to Saudi Arabia and fueling this war that way. Let these people figure out a way to work it out and maybe help them to do so, but stop helping them to kill each other. All right, that's where I wrap up the show for today. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus, immersionnews.com is the name of my news website. Immersion News is the name on mine. Facebook is Libertarian Union, and Twitter is at KYAAALE.